This guy, I would say out of anybody in my life, has single-handedly changed the course of my life within 4 years. And if there's no better endorsement for following him, signing up to his academy, and listening to him very carefully, it's 4 years ago, I was unemployed. I got fired for not getting the COVID vaccine. This guy gave me the courage to speak the truth, to admit how I felt about it, to fight it, to give up half of my friends, to give up family. I got fired for the evil deed of being a straight white male from a acting management company, kicked out of Hollywood. I recorded the phone call, and I have a lawsuit in the Supreme Court. This guy gave me the courage. The woke DEI is destroying this country. And he is trying his very best. I think he's doing a great job trying to fix the university, which is broken and brainwashing and the result of a lot of the stuff you see today. Please check out the brand new Peterson Academy. Stand up straight with your shoulders back, and please welcome Jordan B. Peterson.
Thank you. Thank you all. Well, it's quite a sight to see all you arrayed against the monument back there. Yeah, well, thanks very much for coming. So I've got 20 minutes to explain to you what happened to your august institutions of higher learning. So you ready for that? All right, so I guess the first thing to understand is that there's actually something causing this, and it's not trivial. Some of it's malevolence and some of it's incompetence, but there's actually a philosophical issue at the base of it that isn't trivial. And I want to walk you through that a little bit because it's relevant to what we're doing here today. So I've accused the universities, let's say, broadly speaking, of falling into the hands of the postmodern neo-marxists. And so I want to walk you through that because whether you know it or not, it deeply affects your life. So what's happened in the last 30 years, not least in the field of literary criticism, which I suspect isn't high on your list of priorities, but the thing is, it's crucially important, you see, because it turns out that we live by stories. In fact, what a story appears to be something like the description of the value structure through which we look at the world. And you know, people are very attracted to stories. We're trying to get our story straight here today. We're trying to get the story of the country and the West straight. Stories matter. And so it turns out that literary critics matter because they assess and analyze stories. And if they do that badly or in an ideologically biased manner, it turns out to matter far more than anybody might think. Now, the thing about the postmodernists, many of whom were French intellectuals, a particularly reprehensible breed of intellectual in my estimation, the thing about the French intellectuals is that they figured out that we see the world through a story, that was technically true. And that's a revolutionary idea. You know, the more scientific types, you know, you heard the doctrine, the dogma, follow the science. It's like science isn't something you follow. Science is a set of facts or a process for investigating facts. Science isn't something you follow. A story is something that you follow. A story is something that guides you. And so it matters that you know what a story is, that it's the structure that you inhabit, that organizes your psychology and unites us socially. It matters that you know that, and it also matters what the story is. Now, the postmodernists weren't reprehensible because they figured out that we lived in a story, that even scientists lived in a story. The postmodernists were reprehensible, and this was particularly true in the case of France, was because once they figured out that we lived in a story, which was a mystery, what story, what is the story, what should it be, they jumped to a premature conclusion. And the premature conclusion that they jumped to, being leftist intellectuals, was that the proclamation of the Marxists that the story we live by is one of power was true. So first they concluded that we lived in a story. Fair enough, that happens to be the case. Second, they concluded, without sufficient analysis, that the story that human beings live in is one of power. Now this is a very pathological conclusion, but what we'll do first is give it its due. When individuals and societies become corrupt, their story becomes one of power. But that doesn't mean that the fundamental story is one of power. That's a completely different claim. Now, you can understand that if your relationship with yourself deteriorates, that you become a tyrant to yourself. And you can understand that if your marriage deteriorates, you become a tyrant to your husband or your wife. The same applies to your children and a family. The same might apply to your employees and your broader community. If you are walking off the straight and narrow path, you can become a tyrannical power monger. Okay, but and the Marxist criticism has always been something like that, you know, that the economic system is based on oppression, that the fundamental relationship between man and woman is one of oppressor and oppression, that the familial relationship between parents and children is best construed as a power dynamic, that the capitalist system itself is corrupt because it's tyrannical and predicated on, what would you say, patriarchal exploitation. You can explain the whole bloody world on the basis of power, but that's not a good thing to do if it's not the story that does run people who are aiming properly upward. And it's not the proper story at all if you understand that once you accept the doctrine that only power rules, that enables you to use nothing but power. You see, and that's another thing that happens with the Marxists and the radical types. Their claim is that there's no overarching, genuine narrative, genuine story that unites us. All there is power. And so, as soon as you accept that, you and I don't have a discussion. We don't have anything to talk about. I have a power claim, and you have a power claim, and all there is a battleground of those power claims. There's nothing outside of that. And that's, well, first of all, you can see how, if everyone accepted that claim, that the world would be hell very quickly. Because if there's nothing that governs your relationship with yourself, your relationship with your wife, or your children, your husband, but power, then there's no game but power, and there's no victory but the victory of power. Well, that's a terrible way to structure yourself psychologically. You're your own bloody tyrant, and it's a brutal way to structure your family and your community. But the question is, well, if it's not power that unites us, if it isn't the lens of power and oppression through which we see the world, what is the appropriate story? What's the real story? What's the true story? Is there a true story? Is there a transcendent story that unites us? Well, I would say that people have been wrestling with that issue since the dawn of time, trying to get our story straight. That's what all religious systems do, for example. And that's what all political systems do, secondarily. It's what all ideological systems do. And so that begs another very complex question is, like, how do we discriminate the pathological stories from the healthy stories, let's say, from the upward aiming stories? And this is a complicated matter. And so part of the reason the universities have become corrupted is because they noticed the truth of the claim that we live in stories and accepted far too quickly the claim that the only story that truly exists among human beings is one of power. But it's an attractive idea, and it's true when systems become corrupt. So there's something to the culture war that's deep, and that's why it's so pervasive. All right, so now what we're trying to do, for example, at a gathering like this, is to figure out, well, we feel, we understand, we sense, we intuit that the notion that it's only power that structures the relationship between people is wrong. Okay, so, well, what's the alternative? All right, so I'll give you a sense of what that alternative might be. All right, so, and I think it'll be understandable almost immediately. So, I've been studying the fundamental stories that have, what would you say, produced the soil on which this country grew, right? the stories of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And there's one insistence in that collection of stories, in the biblical narratives, for example, that the fundamental foundation of society is sacrifice. Okay, that's a lot different than power. In fact, it's the opposite claim. So what is meant by sacrifice? Well, work. Work. When you work, you sacrifice. Well, what are you sacrificing? You're sacrificing the pleasures of the moment for the well-being and stability and productivity of the people around you, your family, for example, your future self, and the broader community. It's a sacrificial gesture, right? It's the gesture that defines maturity and responsibility itself. The community is founded on sacrifice. Now, this is essentially true by definition. All you have to do is think it through. If it's all about you, which would mean no sacrifice was necessary, if it was all about your immediate whims, if it was all about your success in the domain of power, no sacrifice would be necessary, because you'd just be able to do exactly what you wanted whenever you wanted to do it. If it's about something beyond you, then sacrifice is immediately necessary. Well, so what does that show? It shows that sacrifice is genuinely the basis of community. You can get along with other people because it's not all about you right now. And so sacrifice is literally the basics of the community. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what's the highest possible form of sacrifice? And there's two classic answers to that. One is the sacrifice of a child. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that if you raise your children properly, you offer them up to the highest possible aim. Now, you know that because that's what you're trying to do when you teach your children to take turns, to be good to other people, to act reciprocally, to be courageous, to be, what would you say, to contend with the difficulties of the world in a responsible manner, right? That's what you're doing, is you're... And the other most fundamental form of sacrifice is the sacrifice of yourself. Obviously. And what does that mean? Well, you know what that means if you're a responsible and mature person. You know, one of the things my wife told me when she had children was that her first child in particular was a great relief that it wasn't about her anymore. Right? She really appreciated that someone now was more important than she was existentially. That she had something genuine and deep to serve, to sacrifice herself to. Sacrifice is the basis of community. Okay, we got that right in the West. Like the crucifixion itself is a symbol of ultimate sacrifice. Right, and okay, so the idea that sacrifice is the basis of community, that's a way different claim than the idea that power is the basis of the community. In fact, it's the opposite claim, is that the highest form of service that you can manage as an individual is the full expression of yourself in service to what's highest about what stabilizes the future, and it is what is beneficial to your family and the broader community. And I believe, and I think you can think about this even biologically, even scientifically, that your deepest instincts align with that. And they align with that in this manner, is that if you follow the pathway of maximum meaning and maximum adventure, it'll feel that way to you. That's the same pathway that expands you in a mature manner and aims you at the kind of sacrifice that makes you everything you could be and that stabilizes the community. And that's a great thing. And we don't know that. We don't exactly know that consciously in the West, but it's embedded in our underlying stories. And part of what's happening, I think, around the world and what's bringing people like you all together in a platform like this is that we're actually starting to understand this explicitly. And we need to, because our culture is torn apart by, particularly, let's say, by the claims of power. Is that it's all about power. It's like, no. It's all about voluntary sacrifice and the meaning that you can find in adventurous responsibility. And that's a very different story. Now, it's also, and I'll close with this, it's also the story that does something very interesting politically. And I also started to understand this more deeply because of my investigations into these underlying narratives. So imagine that you adopted the pathway of maximal responsibility in your life, right? A meaningful pathway of maximal responsibility. Now you start to act that out. Well, what does it mean? Well, first of all, it means you're going to take care of yourself like you matter. And then someone else doesn't have to do that. So you're off the dependency road, right? You're not a burden. You're not a burden to anyone else, including yourself. But then maybe you get good at it and you can also take care of your wife or your husband, you know, in a mutual relationship. And then you get better at that and you can take care of your kids and you're better at that. Now you can take care of people in the broader community that you're serving as an employer, for example, or as an employee. And then you can act politically. And so here's the ancient rule. The alternative to tyranny and slavery, which you can see developing in our culture as this power narrative plays out, is the maximal responsibility you take on yourself. And the reason for that is, if you do all the work, there's no place for the tyrant. There's nothing for them to do. So, right. So, you know, in the Old Testament stories, God himself tells the Israelites who want a king that they don't need one. That if they maintain the proper covenant with what's divine, let's say, if they aim themselves upward and take responsibility, there's no reason for a king. And the reason for that is that everyone serves as their own king. And your country knows this. You know, and you people, I believe, you're here today in part to express that. You know that there's a burden of responsibility that falls on you and the opportunity that goes along with that. And you feel that if you stood up straight properly and you took the responsibility of governance on yourself, which is what you're trying to do, for example, by being here, that the necessity for the tyrant and the corresponding inevitability of the slave would vanish. And I really do believe that that's the fundamental... I do believe that that's the fundamental promise of the free West, and more particularly that that's exemplified by your country. And so we're all attempting to remind ourselves once again of that, and to dispense with the presupposition that although we live in a story that it's one of power, it's not one of power. It's one of freedom and maximal voluntary responsibility. And on that you can build anything. So you remember when you walk away from this event that it's not what the problem is, precisely, that's the issue. It's what you specifically could and should do about the problem, in the realization that if you took that burden onto yourself, the burden of dealing with what bothers you, let's say politically, the burden of dealing with that directly, that you would also have the responsible adventure of your life, and you would fight against the forces of tyranny and slavery in the most possibly effective manner. And that's a much better story, psychologically and socially, a much better story than the one that insists on the dynamic of power. And so it's a story we can understand, and it's a story we can act out, and it's a story that'd be beneficial to us spiritually and in our families, in our community, and it's a story that we could spread widely and properly embody. And if everyone did that, then everyone would have the romantic adventure of their life, and we could take advantage, maximal advantage, of the outstanding field of opportunity itself to us, and which is still making itself manifest today. And so, onward, upward, maximum responsibility, no tyranny and slavery, and the proper story. Thank you very much.
Decide to build an online university.
Thank you very much, everybody. Yeah.
There is a crisis now in higher education. I experimented with putting my lectures online, and I thought, why not scale that? We find the best lectures in the world so that people can benefit from liberal arts style education, no matter their age or financial resources. I think it's funny, because I got canceled at the university, so I could try to return the favor.